Middle East Institute, as well as the Arab American Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce our main speaker today, Dr. Jim Zogby, who will be talking to us about changing American attitudes towards the Israel-Palestine conflict. Very timely issue indeed. And then we will be hearing from a very distinguished panel to talk about the report that's just been released. It's called American Attitudes, Changing Opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And then we'll hear from three panelists who I will introduce here briefly, and you can see their full bios on the landing page for this event. First, we have Rania Batrice, who is founder and president of Batrice Associates, a strategic policy and public relations firm specializing in making progressive vision a reality. Then we'll hear from Peter Beinart, who is a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, as well as a noted author and thinker. And last but certainly not least, we have Lara Friedman, who is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. You can, as I said, you can see their full bios on the landing page, and I believe also we'll be posting in the chat the Twitter handles for each of our panelists. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Jim, why don't you give us a quick summary? I understand you have a presentation to show us on your latest findings.
Thanks, Khaled, and thanks to the Foundation and to the Middle East Institute for hosting this. And of course, thanks to my own institute for sponsoring it, and my brother, John Zogby Strategies, that actually conducted the poll with EMI. We've been polling on issues of this sort now for many years and have noted a deep partisan divide on issues of this sort. One of the things about this poll, though, is that the split, because of some shifts internally within the Democratic and Republican component groups, the shift is now more ideological than it is demographic, and that was one of the things I noted here. And in some of the charts you'll see, I use liberal, very liberal one side, conservative, very conservative on the other side. And that's because, as a colleague and friend, Shibli Telhami, noted in an article he just did for Brookings, the evangelicals, who are the driving force on the Republican side, are losing support among young evangelicals. They're going more the way of millennials and younger voters generally. And so on some issues, there's a bit of a balancing between the parties in a way that I hadn't seen before. So let's just start right off. First is attitudes towards Israelis and Palestinians. We'll go to the first slide here, that I think is quite interesting, in that you'll see. No, that's not the first slide. Going back to the beginning. Yeah, that was at the very end. No. Okay, we're having a little bit of difficulty here. Let me just say that what we find is that, of course, as has been the case now for decades, there's more support for Israel overall than there is for Palestinians. But there are favorable views of both. Here we are, favorable views of Israelis, 58% overall, and among Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives, also favorable support. Democrat numbers are 46% favorable. That's low. Now let's go to the Palestinian side, and what you'll see is the next slide is support for Palestinians. Nope, go back one. Support for Palestinians, overall 39%, among Democrats 51%, and among liberals 60%. Those are the two high. Now to the next slide, just to make the comparison of the two, what you find is that for the first time we have, no, back one, that's it. You have more favorable views of Palestinians among Democrats than among Israelis. I'd not seen that before. that Democrats had more favorable view of Palestinians than of Israelis. Down below, you'll see a comparison of the two on most of the issues that we cover here in the poll. Again, Democratic numbers far more favorable than the Republican, but in some cases, the gap is closing, and we'll talk about that as we get to them. Let's go to the next one, which is attitude toward Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is actually one of the key drivers here of changing attitudes among Democrats over the years. His favorable rating among Democrats is very low. No crowing here for the Israeli side, but Mahmoud Abbas and Ismail Haniyeh also have very low favorables. They're not well liked, but Netanyahu's numbers are significant and low. The numbers here aren't presented, but among Democrats, he only has a 21% favorable rating and a negative rating of 40%. Let's go to the next slide. And the next two are going to deal more with the issue of balanced policy. You can see overall that, no, back one, that's it. How should the Biden administration approach it? Overall, among every cross-group, subgroup, except for Republicans and conservatives, they want a policy that strikes a middle balance between the two. And even among Republicans, the number is 37% favor Israel and 34% balance, so that there's a balancing of Republicans who want it to be a more balanced policy, and among all the other groups here, independents, Democrats, and liberals, of course, you have striking a balance between the two. Let's go to the next slide, which is, should the US always side with Israel or be an honest broker? Honest broker wins, and wins among Republicans as well. Let's go to the next slide. Do you agree or disagree that they're equal people? This is an interesting one because this issue is being framed now, for example, in the Democratic Party platform. President Biden said equal support for both, or that they are equally deserving of rights and life and the rest. And here you have very strong support among every single cross group, Democrats, Republicans, independents, conservatives, and liberals, that they're equal people entitled to equal rights. When you frame it that way, that's what you get. Let's go to the next one. Do you agree or disagree that there should be an independent Palestinian state? There are those who argue that we're past the time to have an independent Palestinian state. And I guess it's lamentable that at the very point in history where there may not be able to be an independent Palestinian state, almost all the groups agree that there should be one. Let's go to the next one. This is about the recent conflict. Did Israel use too much force, just right, or not enough? Overall, too much force wins. And certainly among liberals, 52% said too much force. And among Democrats, 43% too much force. Among Republicans and conservatives, it was just right or maybe not enough. Let's go to the next. Increased sympathy for Israelis, high among Republicans and conservatives. Increased sympathy for Palestinians, high among Democrats and liberals. Increased sympathy toward both wins out overall, with 28% overall, and then very high numbers among independents, which is driving it. Let's go to the next one. Is Israel right to evict? This is interesting because Democrats disagree strongly, liberals disagree strongly, and Republicans are ambivalent on it. They are almost split between, as are conservatives, split between, did Israel have the right to evict or not right to evict? Independents, incidentally, agreeing with Democrats and liberals that Israel was wrong to evict people. Let's go to the next slide. The 735 million from Congress. Biden's only support on this comes from Republicans and conservatives. Democrats, independents, and liberals all agree with the push from Congress to hold back on it, to hold back on approving. that 735 million. Next, go to the next slide. On settlements, you get opposition overall, strong opposition among Democrats, strong opposition among liberals, and among Republicans, support for it, and among conservatives, support. And among independents, the numbers are split, with a stronger number saying that it was correct policy to oppose settlements, but 41% just not sure. So overall, there's opposition to settlements. Now, this is the next one I think is important, and that is, if Israel continues to provide support for settlements, what should the U.S. do? Unrestricted financial and military assistance, or the aid should be restricted if it continues to violate policy and build settlements? Only 28% say continue to provide aid unrestricted. 51% say restrict the aid if they violate rights. And look at the numbers among Democrats, independents, and liberals. A majority, strong majority among Democrats and liberals. So here's the point, I guess. What I'd say is that when you hear people on the progressive side of the Democratic Party speaking about these issues like restricting aid, you're hearing them represent where the base of the Democratic Party is right now. When you hear people like Chuck Schumer and Bob Menendez and others sort of being a little more ambivalent in how they speak about this issue, less decisively pro-Israel, you're hearing them also picking up the drift of what's going on in the country, in particular among Democrats. I mean, with 62% of Democrats saying restrict aid if Israel continues to violate policy, and among liberals, or progressives in this case, 75%, that's a significant shift in where opinion is on the Democratic side. And overall, 51% of all Americans want to restrict aid, because among Republicans, the numbers are almost evenly split, with 42% saying unrestricted aid and 39% saying you should restrict the aid if they violate policy. That's a very significant number. Let's go to the next slide, which is a trend line slide about whether equal rights are, both people are deserving of equal rights. The numbers have always been high there. That is an interesting way to frame the question. This is the highest we've seen at 73%. And the next one, which is, should we oppose settlement policy? The numbers have gone in the last 5 years from 33% opposed to 41% opposed. And on allowing Israel to build settlements, it's their right. It stayed from 25 to 26, didn't move at all, but the unsure has dropped from 42 to 33. So basically, the numbers have moved from unsure to we should oppose their settlements. So I'll stop there and eager to hear what you all think. You're on mute, Khaled.
Thanks, Jim. There's obviously a lot going on in these polls, and I'm eager to sort of jump in and try to unpack these with you and with our panelists. Before I do, let me just point out something I neglected to state at the outset, and that is we welcome questions from the audience. Please submit those questions in the Q&A box. We already have one question that I'm going to put to you, Jim, before we go to the panelists, because it's about your, could you just tell us a little bit about your methodology? How large was your sample, and so forth? You're muted.
As in the back of the poll, when people get a copy, the methodology was, it was an online survey done with EMI, which is they're one of the tops in the industry. The demographics were largely comport with the overall public. I mean, in terms of men, women, educated, uneducated, the various, the racial breakout, and well, let's see, gender, education, religion, etc. So EMI is their standard online methodology employed. And
Okay,
1,011, I think, was the sample size.
Thanks. So I want to turn to Rania first and get your thoughts. How does what you've seen and heard so far jibe with what you're seeing on the grassroots level, or based on your own encounters with people?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will just point out, I've worked in March of this year, it was 21 years in politics for me. And I will first say that there has been just a massive shift in the willingness to have the conversation in those political circles. And I think that's really important. I also just want to name, there's so much incredible information that Dr. Zogby pointed out that we see in the survey. But one of those things is the not sure column. And I think why I think that's interesting, it might be not what everybody thinks I'm going to say. There has been a drop in those numbers we've seen over the years, but there's still a significant opportunity for education there. And I think I can say with some certainty that there has been a fear to have these conversations within political circles. So there are any number of people out there who really are not sure, because we haven't been able to have these conversations in real substantive ways outside of with each other, quite frankly. And so that open door within that electoral side of things, I think, is a huge opportunity to educate. And we are seeing an openness to some of those conversations. Now, that being said, there's still a lot of head banging against the wall, I know, for me and for many people, because of a lack of education. And there's misinformation and disinformation, just like in any issue. And so again, it's a frustration, but it's also a huge opportunity, and we are seeing it play out in real time. Even members of Congress, the number of members of Congress who've come out and just been willing to talk about the imbalance of power, and the realities on the ground. And we saw the report from Human Rights Watch recently calling Israel an apartheid state. There's just a lot more willingness to have these frank conversations than I've ever seen in my career. And of course, Dr. Zogby's been around longer than I have, so he's got an additional perspective. But in my career, even 10 or 15 years ago versus where we are now feels very, very different.
Thanks, Rania. Peter, let's hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks for having me in an act of shameless self-promotion. I'm going to put my newsletter in the chat. If anyone is interested, it's free. Often deals with these subjects. I guess a couple things strike me. Obviously, there's a partisan divide, and so you see the in some ways, inexorable partisan polarization taking place on virtually every issue, working its way through on this issue as well. But there's also a really very large divide between the population and in general and members of Congress, right? I mean, in some issues, you could say that actually Republican public opinion is to the left of where Democrats in Congress are, right? I mean, I think, right, a plurality of Republicans say they want a balanced approach. That's not the position of most Democrats in Congress, right? And Republicans, they're almost a plurality. Republicans are roughly split on the question of conditioning aid. Democrats are not roughly split on the issue of conditioning aid. The vast majority of Democrats in Congress still oppose conditioning aid. So you have a partisan divide at the grassroots, and actually, but there's also at least as large a gap between people at the grassroots, in some ways, of both parties, of the Democrats, of course, more, and their politicians. Then the question is, to what degree, what does that transmission belt look like from public opinion and up until to influence politicians? And that's where I have, that's where I think we need to be careful about assuming that there's some kind of inexorable process, right? I mean, take gun control, right? I mean, for gun control for a very, very long time has had this massive gap between public opinion. And we're also, it's not just, there are other issues on which you can also see a very, very large gap over a large period of time between where the public is and where politicians are. And it's also worth remembering, of course, that we are also in a moment of genuine crisis in the United States in terms of our democratic mechanisms, right? It's very unclear about whether even the kind of moderate levels of democratic transmission function that we have now, right, in terms of the way we conduct elections, et cetera, will be maintained given what Republicans are doing at the state legislatures and others. So I think that it's very, very much an open question, even if this public opinion continues to move, about whether, how much that will be translated into what we see from politicians.
Thanks, Peter. Lara, so what's your take on the trends that we're seeing in terms of public opinion and the politics side, and maybe the gap?
Thanks. And I'll try not to repeat things that other people have said. Great comments from everyone. Look, I was very excited to read this latest set of polling data. And I think what's important, I've been on numerous panels for Jim in previous years with polling data, and this is not out of the blue, right? This is part of a trend line. It has been true for a very, very long time that there is a chasm between policymakers on both sides of the aisle and public opinion when it comes to Israel-Palestine. And I think part of it we haven't really talked about is unpacking why there is that chasm. Is it because they don't understand what their grassroots wants and they just need to have better access to polling data and more information from wonks? And that may be a piece of it. Is it because people who are being elected to Congress have deep personal commitments of their own when it comes to Israel-Palestine, which are untouchable? When it doesn't matter what the grassroots thinks, this is something that is in their heart. And that may be part of it. I think, though, that a bigger part of it is that politicians on all issues are most sensitive to various subsets of constituents, whether those constituents are voters who make the most noise, whether they are donors who are there the most concerned about making sure they keep on board, whether it is the loudest voices, the squeaky wheel. What has been clear for a long time for all of us who've worked, whether it's with Capitol Hill or with successive administrations from both parties, is that you get into rooms with politicians, close the door, and they say over and over, yes, I agree with your moderate, reasonable positions on Israel-Palestine, and I know that there's a grassroots that agrees, but I don't dare do that because the cost will be too high. For a long time, there was a popular wisdom that said, if I do this, I will not be able to fundraise. A lot of us argued that that was never true. And I think the first Bernie Sanders candidacy for president proved that wasn't true when he actually was able to fundraise on being reasonable and serious and constructive on Israel-Palestine. But that didn't matter. That is still a very powerful fiction. If you talk to members of Congress, certainly in the last election cycle where this issue played a significant role, and you saw things like Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, you saw essentially people come in who are clearly more progressive on Israel-Palestine, who didn't run on this issue at all, but they were running to replace people who were seen as stronghold leaders on the status quo policies, and the effort to defeat them by effectively saying they were going to be bad on Israel-Palestine, or forces that are Israel-Palestine focused making, like Democratic majority for Israel, going after them without maybe making it about Israel, but it was, they failed. And you would think that that would lend some backbone. And yet you still have this view, and you hear it from people within certainly the Democratic Party, that going too far on a limb on Israel-Palestine, even if it's an individual candidate can bear it and can still win, that the costs for the party are high. And I think that's where you get into what we're seeing the narrative shifting to right now in the United States on Israel-Palestine, which is a concerted effort to shift it from a debate about Israel's policy and the US role in how it deals with Israel and the Palestinians to a debate about anti-Semitism. Because you bring anti-Semitism into the political debate and suddenly people are very, very worried. And this is we've seen what this looks like. And Peter brought up the point of our democratic institutions and the fundamental problems with trying to just because you're right doesn't mean you'll get good policy or good law. And here I'll point, and looking at Jim's data on views on boycotts, on legitimacy of boycotts, which is always an interesting question. There isn't a question here on legitimacy of free speech, right? If you poll both Democrats and Republicans, from the most conservative to the most liberal on both sides of the aisle, they will put themselves out there as the absolute defenders of free speech, including Republicans on the Hill this week, out there railing against efforts to quash free speech on campus. And yet you have bipartisan efforts across the United States that have yielded legislation which is brazenly unconstitutional that quashes free speech in order to quash criticism of Israel. And there's no sort of sense of looking internally and seeing, does this respond to the grassroots in any way? Or are you doing sort of squeaky wheel, loudest person with the most money, or organizations with the most money pushing this? And when there is pushback, as we saw, for instance, with Stacey Abrams defending her vote against this years ago in Georgia, it's framed as this is an anti-Semitic thing. If you're opposing this legislation, you're an anti-Semite, and now you have to defend yourself against that. So, I look at this data, and on the one hand, I feel heartened that America is not in a terrible position and understands maybe the complexity and the humanity of both sides and all of that. But I still am waiting, and I think, Jim, you have some valuable wisdom. We were talking a little bit before we started about how you challenge these very deeply held perceptions of where politicians can go politically on this, where they have space to move, what they can do, because those perceptions become reality. If politicians believe they cannot move on this, regardless of what the grassroots says, regardless of what their constituents want, then they don't. And I'd be fascinated actually to come back to you and hear some insights on that.
Thanks, Lara. I'm gonna start curating some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. But before that, I want to put a question. This question of attitudes towards the leadership versus the people. Not surprising that we see both with regard to Palestinians and Israelis that people have a higher favorability than their leaders. But I was struck by the fact that Netanyahu's favorability and unfavorability is still higher than Mahmoud Abbas. Even though there's so much negativity associated with him, and that we often hear that a lot of democratic dissatisfaction with Israel is sort of bound up in the Trump Netanyahu axis and sort of the person of Netanyahu himself. What do you attribute that to? Is that just sort of kind of residual pro-Israelism, kind of a default position that the public says, well, Israeli leaders are generally better than Palestinian leaders? And I would add to that the leader of Hamas, or a leader of Hamas, the public perceptions were negative, but not that different than Mahmoud Abbas's approval or disapproval. So it kind of suggests that it doesn't matter if you're a Palestinian and you support diplomacy, or if you're Palestinian and you support, armed struggle and violence, from the standpoint of public opinion. I'm interested to hear, what's your take on that?
Yeah, two observations. One is that if you look at these polls, the numbers on Mahmoud Abbas, for example, have an extraordinarily high unsure number. Secondly, back in the 2004-05 period, we did a poll on a number of Palestinian leaders. We found that Mahmoud Abbas's numbers were 53% favorable and 17% unfavorable. And I sent it over to a friend of mine in the West Bank who said, wow, this is great. I said, yeah, but it's derivative. It's not him. It's derived from the fact that, number one, he's not Arafat. And number two, George Bush has embraced him, as have some Democrats. And so that's why he is viewed as favorably as he is. If he doesn't do something to earn those numbers, they're going to define him as they would want to, and they did. And so in 10 years later, in the middle of the last decade, we polled again, And his numbers were as they are here, something like 13% favorable and 51 or 2% unfavorable, a complete reverse. And I said at the time, just as his very high favorables were unearned, undeserved, his unfavorables now are unearned and undeserved. He became a creature of being defined by some Democrats and Republicans here in the States, and then he became a creature who was defined by how the Israelis wanted to perceive him. And we're still there now. So he is viewed here through the lens of how he has largely been projected by those who do it. Palestinians do no projecting at all. They don't have a Hasbara machine. They don't have anything to make their leaders. I mean, Arafat was viewed as an ugly toad. I remember Edward Said saying that, compared with what, Golda Meir and Shamir and Begin, back when Edward was speaking. I mean, as if they would win beauty contests anywhere. But the issue was that the side who did the projecting, if one side is playing the game and the other side's not playing the game, guess who's going to win? And the Israelis have defined Mahmoud Abbas. And they've defined all Palestinian leaders that way. And so Palestinians lose the debate. It's surprising that Netanyahu's number are as good as they are, but look at the Democratic views of Netanyahu, 21% favorable, 40% unfavorable. And I think a lot of the attitudes towards Israel generally among Democrats are a function of two things: the Netanyahu Obama feud, if you will. It was a one-sided feud from Netanyahu, and then the Trump-Netanyahu marriage on the other side. Those two things locked in place among Democrats. This is not our guy. And secondly, among the demographic groups, young people in particular, and people of color who have alternative sources of information, they now see what Israel and Netanyahu are doing, and that has helped shift the discourse, as opposed to on the evangelical side, they're hearing from a whole range of preachers telling them that Israel is the necessary ingathering of the Jews, so they will convert to Christianity and ultimately bring back the second coming of Christ in the final days. I mean, they see it through that lens. So I think that accounts for where we get the numbers on that. But to Laura's point for a second, I think that there really is a shift here in the congressional debate. And I'd say that to you, Peter, that we did have an election where Eliot Engel lost, where Dan Lipinski lost, where Cora Bush won. And we even see with the Democratic majority for Israel that when they pour money into a campaign, they never make it about Israel, because they know Melman's smart enough a pollster to know that's not a winner. You're not going to get votes for Eliot Engel by saying, vote for Eliot Engel because he's going to give $3.8 billion a year to Israel and never question anything they do. So instead, what they did was they made it about Jamal Bowman's financial history. They made it about Bernie Sanders being too old, too socialist, will lose down ballot. They never once raised the issue of Bernie Sanders. I would see these ads calling out Bernie on all these personal issues, sponsored by Democratic Majority for Israel, had nothing to do with Israel because they're smart enough to know that. It's not a winner these days. So silence and pressure on the one side is the way that they'll work it. And I do think that this year's debate on the thing that Mark Pocan hosted was really significant. I'd only seen that happen one other time with far fewer members. And even more significant than them speaking out was Schumer and Menendez and others not speaking out more forcefully. They caught the drift. Schumer doesn't want to get primaried, and he knows where progressives are. And so I don't see a direct transmission belt, Peter, between the numbers and the shift, but the numbers do indicate a sort of a movement on the tectonic plates, and that's ultimately going to show up in the debate. We had a debate this year. I don't recall in any of the conflicts, that, including the disaster in Lebanon in '82, I never recall a debate here like this one.
I just want to also echo what you're saying, Jim. And my firm had the honor of doing the IEs for Jamal Bowman, Mondaire Jones, Cori Bush, who are all people I think that have been mentioned. And there were absolute whisper campaigns happening, and there were questions being asked. They were trying to poll on this and see if it was effective. And just like you said, not once was that brought up in any of the attack ads, and not once was that anything we had to message on our end either. And I do think that is significant. And frankly, something my career being what it is, I haven't seen that before. I haven't seen it be so clear that this is not the issue that is resonating and landing with people. I want to say one more thing that was brought up a couple of times. I do think, and let me preface this by saying I don't think from a justice perspective, and I am a justice person at my core, I don't think religion should matter, but I do think there is this lack of understanding and knowledge among white evangelicals that there are in fact Christian Palestinians, and watching their faces both my parents were born in Palestine. I was raised Catholic. I am one of them, and watching some of the faces just contort and trying to understand, back to what I was saying, not to be a broken record, there is so much need and room and opportunity for education that we have not had the lane to really put out there in a big way. It was long ago, and at that point, I was actually Bernie's deputy campaign manager in 2016. It's the reason to be honest, that was the world.
Okay, I think we're having a little trouble with Rania's connection, but
Khaled, can I add something?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I want to give you both a chance. Peter, why don't you go first, and then we'll hear from Lara.
Yeah, I guess I just want to make a couple of alternative points about how to see this. Although I certainly, from a normative perspective, I certainly hope that Rania is entirely correct. First of all, just to say, it's not as if there are not young politicians who are also people of color, who also have on other issues some progressive credibility, who are not in the AIPAC lane, right? We talk a lot about Jamal Bowman, but it seems to me it's at least as likely, more likely, that Richie Torres one day ends up as mayor of New York or senator from New York than Jamal Bowman or Hakeem Jeffries, right? And they're still and if a young politician were looking at this and saying who's having an easier time of it, Richie Torres and Hakeem Jeffries, who are progressive except Palestine, quote unquote, or Jamal Bowman, who's having an easier day. I think they might choose the Torres and Hakeem Jeffries. The other point I would just make is that I think a lot of this depends on where we put the baseline. I mean, Jim knows this very well, right? We're comparing these numbers to, let's say, 2010, right, or 2015 or 2000. In the early 1990s, everyone here knows, right, there was a Republican president who conditioned U.S. aid on settlement growth, and there were groups of Republicans in Congress who supported that view. During the Cold War, it was pretty common for American presidents to condition U.S. aid to Israel, often on what Israel was doing, in other parts of the Middle East, not necessarily vis-a-vis Palestinians. So I also worry a little bit that we have been at a kind of artificial high watermark in terms of the unambiguous unwillingness to basically, condition aid at all. But we may still not get back. We're still a long way from where we were during the Reagan years, given what Ronald Reagan was willing to do vis-a-vis Israel. And even that wasn't enough really to change its trajectory. So I guess these are the notes of caution that I would inject.
So I would just, a couple things to add. When I was reading this, the data in this latest polling, my thought was, I hope there are crosstabs by district because fundamentally all politics are local. And I think one of the challenges of reading national polls is to understand how it translates for individual politicians in individual races, because I think that's a really big deal. I think there are different places where it resonates differently. The other thing, and this is where I do try to find reason actually to be more optimistic, this last election cycle was really quite remarkable in a number of ways. First of all, as we already said, for electing people who, there was an all-out effort against some of these new members coming in because they were concerned they'd be more progressive on Israel and Palestine. But more than that, we saw an all-out effort to unseat a number of members of Congress, particularly known as the Squad, who had been defined as having crossed all lines. If you remember the vicious campaigns, particularly against Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, accusing them of being anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and none of those campaigns worked. People who forecast the one term, in office, one term in the House for these members of Congress, were proven wrong on every count. Every one of these people survived, and they survived fine. And that speaks to this problem of perception for members of Congress. There is a strong belief that exists within much of, I think, on both parties, that if you take on this issue, you will lose. And there are examples. All of us know examples of members. I lived through the Cynthia McKinney and Earl Hilliard experiences on the Hill. These are House members who, according to the narrative around it, the narrative of people who support them when they lost was they were brought down by AIPAC and for their opposition to Israel. That then meets a narrative from defenders of Israel saying it's anti-Semitic to even say that, although AIPAC at the time, I'm pretty sure, publicly claimed some credit for unseating them. But the bottom line is that there are members of Congress at the same time, like Dave Obey from Wisconsin, who was extremely critical of Israel, never aligned really with AIPAC and that kind. He couldn't be. He was not vulnerable. Israel-Palestine is not an issue that takes down members of Congress who are strong and who are popular and have the support of their constituents on all the issues that their constituents care about. And that perception that this is that radioactive issue that if you touch it, it will bring you down, has been challenged in profound ways in the past couple election cycles. I don't know if that has percolated up to members of Congress. I don't know if even where it has percolated up, they face such strong pressures from party leaders who say, well, even if you survive, the costs of the party are too high, you can't go there. But we have seen changes. It's unquestionable. What we saw in the debate around the Gaza crisis this time, like Jim said, I don't remember anything like that colloquy led by Pocan. I don't remember anything like the numbers of members of Congress who came out even before the Hamas rocket started, when it was easier to kind of do a both sidesism crap. There were members who came out even just on Al-Aqsa and Sheikh Jarrah and what was happening in Jerusalem. And the fact that a Menendez needs to come out to the left of the president on this is hugely significant. I don't know whether I hate to take out a crystal ball and say these are permanent shifts or these are shifts that are defining and then will change the way policy works, but they are significant and they are different than in the past.
And I want to say there's shifts that we have to keep building upon. And I feel like we have an open door. We're not done. The work continues, but we have to keep building upon it and not letting up and not, I often use the term being scared into submission. We've all seen it happen in the past. We know what that's like. But the willingness to talk about Palestine and Palestinians as an issue of justice is significant and important, and we can't let go of it.
Thanks. I want to put something to sort of dig a little bit deeper and put this to all of you on this question of what is behind this this shift, and also in terms of its durability. We have a couple questions on that. So how much of this shift is about demographic changes in our country, and so we're seeing a shift in politics in general, greater polarization and so forth on a range of issues. How much of it is that the result of this demographic change in the composition of the United States, and how much is actually across the board? I mean, is it fair to say that changes are happening in all of these different constituencies, however, some smaller or greater than others? So that's one part of it. And in terms of the durability of this shift, how much of it is driven, how much is this change driven by events or personalities? And so that, if we get a different government in Israel that is maybe slightly more to the center, that will change public attitudes. So if you could, I don't know, maybe Jim, you could start us off with how you see the durability and what is driving these changes.
Let's start on the Republican side. Peter mentioned George Herbert Walker Bush and Jim Baker. But I would go back one election before the 92 contest, and it was 88 with Pat Robertson, because what Pat Robertson did was immediately pivot from doing well in Iowa to dropping out of the race and building a movement that within 2 years had taken over 17 states in the Republican Party. His followers controlled 1/3 of the operations of the party nationally. So that by 1992, there was a Palestinian American from here in Washington who was elected to the platform committee. And he put forward a resolution, so proud of this, he put forward a platform plank supporting President Bush and Secretary of State James Baker for convening the Madrid Peace Conference to create a lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. He couldn't get a second for it. Supporting his own president, he couldn't get a second for it in the platform committee. That's how much control the religious right had, even at that early stage. And that has only grown over years. We're beyond the Christian Coalition and the Christian Majority and James Hagee and the like, to now it's ingrained in the party. But as as I mentioned, Shibley's piece is noting, there's a kind of an attrition from the religious right among millennials who are abandoning their views, and that accounts for some of the balancing we see in some of the issues. On the Democratic side, there's a huge demographic issue here, and that's true. I mean, Black Americans see the world in a different way. And they've grown global in their consciousness. Many have. The Black Lives Movement clearly does. And the same with Latinos and Asians, both of whom see the world in a very different way, as do millennials generally. My brother calls them the first globals. They're the first generation who think of themselves as part of the planet rather than just from their local community and their the soccer game or the football game that's coming up next weekend. They have a much broader worldview that has accounted for some of the shifts on this and many other issues, from environment to global peace. These are issues that millennials are different than the traditional thinking of American politics. Reform policy never mattered. It now does matter. And I think that the change is a permanent one. I mean, it's one that you're not going to change people's consciousness. The internet's taking care of that. We're in a different, people have a different worldview. And this issue is a subset of that. It's a reflection of that. It's not so much, this issue doesn't drive that shift, but it's the shift in consciousness and sources of information that are driving the change in attitudes on the Middle East. We no longer have to watch CNN or Fox News to find out what's happening in the Middle East. People are getting their information directly from sources on the ground in the region. And then there is the politics. I mean, as I said, the Netanyahu hostility, invitation to speak to Congress against Obama, the marriage with Donald Trump, that also took a toll. And I was concerned, that if you got a young, handsome, new Israeli prime minister, where the policies wouldn't change a bit. But, I'm sure that there would be some Democrats who would want to sing "Happy Days Are Here Again," but I don't think that would shift the consciousness, the awareness of people as you had an eruption over a settlement or as you had a problem in East Jerusalem. As long as the policies on the ground stay the same, the change in consciousness is going to continue. And I think it's a factor that, as Rania notes, we are seeing play out in contest after contest around the country. What Lara mentioned, the "I'm really with you guys" butt club, has grown, where members of Congress now have to, even as I said, verbally, they have to make it public, as Menendez and Schumer did, that, well, yeah, I kind of still am over here, but let me tell you that we got to be, those are statements from those two guys that I'd never heard before, ever. And that is, I think, a sort of a canary in the coal mine, or an alarm bell that ought to go off for AIPAC. They may still dominate on the Hill, but the forces of change are taking positions all around the Hill. And I think a few more elections and we'll see this shift continue to grow. And at some point we reach a tipping point on it.
Can I jump in on this, or go ahead?
Please.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. I mean, what is it? Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said that, culture matters more than politics. And I think that what you're seeing is a cultural shift, some of which is having a political impact. And I think that there's maybe a few different reasons for it. I mean, I think one of them is that the Black Lives Matter movement, and maybe Me Too as well, I just think have made people, certainly in the media, more conscious of questions of representation than they were before. I think 20 years ago, you could have turned on TV and seen two white guys having a conversation about affirmative action, or two men having a conversation about abortion. And I think there's just more of a consciousness of that. And I think it's seeped its way in to the media this time, where there's a higher level of degree of embarrassment about how often it has been in the past that you have conversations about Palestinians without Palestinians. And then once you bring Palestinians in, I don't always think folks necessarily understand how significant that is, because very often when you bring Palestinians in the conversation, things get said that just would never be said otherwise. Entire, whether it's a reference to the Nakba, all kinds of different perspectives come in that oftentimes are just not there otherwise. So I think that's definitely part of it. And I think that what happened is that Palestinians had to go outside of the mainstream media because they weren't well represented in the mainstream media, and had developed a strong voice on social media. But what you see now is that the mainstream media, or at least the liberal end of the mainstream media, is more responsive to social media than it was, right? I mean, it was Barry, whether you agree with Barry Weiss or not, who said that whatever Twitter is on the editorial pay, is on the payroll of the newspapers. But basically, people in the mainstream media spend a lot of time on social media. So these two conversations are not as bifurcated as they might have been. And what happens on social media comes back into mainstream media. I also think that maybe part of what we're just seeing is the fact that Palestinians, there's an assimilation process where you have more Palestinians who've been in the United States for longer, a larger group of native-born Palestinians. I remember Rashid Khaled once saying to me many years ago, he said, we have to be in the United States long enough to produce our lawyers, And when you think about someone like Rashida Tlaib, or even someone like, Bella Hadid, or someone like that, right? You're talking about people who are a product of the fact that you just have more Palestinians who are born in the United States than they used to be. And I also wonder, and I have no way of proving this, if there could be any, one of the things that I think severely hurt the Palestinian struggle in the American media was 9/11 and the association that was so often made between America's struggle against terrorism and Israel's struggle against terrorism, which was just a way of just kind of knocking out the legitimacy of talking about Palestinian, of the Palestinian movement very often. And I just wonder whether the fact that we kind of have entered a kind of post-war on terror environment here in the United States may have also had an impact in terms of making people be making that a little bit harder, a harder move to make, to basically just rule people out and basically say, oh, they're all terrorists.
Can I just come in for a second on the same point? The New York Times had two pieces recently that were stunning. I'd never seen before. One was a piece in the Sunday paper that began on the front page and continued to 2 full pages inside, interviewing families who'd been affected by the occupation that had never happened before, never. And then just the other day, they published pictures, names, and ages of the Palestinian children killed. I remember when Baruch Goldstein committed the massacre in the mosque in Hebron, there were 2 front page stories in the Washington Post. Why did the good Jewish doctor go bad? There were personal profiles about what happened to this guy. The names of the Palestinians were never, ever mentioned. No one interviewed their families. No one talked to their friends. No one talked to on-site observers about what happened. It was all about, why did this guy do it? And it's because from the beginning, Israel framed the issue. I mean, going back to the film, The Exodus, it was cowboy and Indian scenario where the white guys were on the frontier trying to chop the trees down and remove the native savages so they could build a future. We sang the Exodus song. That was America. That was our story, right? And the Palestinians were the savages. They were objects to be removed. And the equation in the American mind was Israeli humanity versus the Arab problem. We had to solve the problem so humanity could live. That is what's changed, Peter. And I think that's what you're describing, is that it's now humanity and humanity. And it becomes a very different mindset when you actually when Issa Amra gets on CNN to talk about Hebron. That's something that never happened before. So I think that there is this shift in perception, in media perception, but it's been driven by these, I think, new demographic groups who have forced the change from the bottom up. I'll stop there. Sorry, but
I do want to, Jim. Jim mentioned millennials. I also want to mention Gen Z, and I'm going to tie all of this together because I think it does matter. They are a long.
Rania, we're losing you.
Yeah.
So let's come back to Rania. Lara, I see you, and I'm going to come to you. I just want to make one quick point before that. Just picking up on Peter's point about 9/11, because I also feel like this was a major inflection point, obviously on many levels. But I feel like there was, the culture war was sort of triggered in both directions in that moment. There was the holy crap, what has America been doing all over the world, and why do they hate us, and is there sort of some introspection going on there? But then there was also a kind of backlash against that in terms of well, yeah, this is what happens, because the Islamofascism and the inherent threat that Islam poses to Western civilization. And so now you have that trend even within, there's a brand of Christian Zionism that is purely secular, that is not based on end of times theology, but is simply that views Israel as a bastion of Western civilization, and sort of holding off the Islamic hordes. You see that trend in the Tea Party. So I think maybe a lot of the polarization that we see, I also kind of locate in that moment post 9/11. And now, Lara, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back. There's a couple of questions in the queue about the issue of anti-Semitism, which I think really, it's not really part of the polling, because we all want to think of it as in terms of the polling, it is a separate issue, but in terms of how people react to this issue, it's right in the heart of it. Anyone who is looking at the debate right now around what happened in Gaza and the West Bank in the past few weeks, in Jerusalem and inside the Green Line, will note that there is a pivot to making this about anti-Semitism. You have a letter from a group of Democrats in Congress this week attacking fellow Democrats and basically saying that if you use the term apartheid to talk about Israel and its policies, you're an anti-Semite. That it says, they use the term at the core, this is at its core anti-Semitic. I think that's the actual language. And I mean, this is the language used by Human Rights Watch and by B'Tselem and by the top, legal mind of Israel, Michael Sfard. But when it's used by members of Congress who are progressive, and particularly if those progressives are women or women of color or Muslim women of color, and I'll note that Mark Pocan actually pointed out early on in this last round of Gaza fighting that the attackers, particularly so some very hardcore right-wing Republicans who are attacking Democrats for being anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, seem to not care at all about anything he said and only care about things that were said by Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. And it's not for nothing, right? That this happens over and over. The the clear trend we've seen for years, this is not new, is that when Israel's policies are difficult to defend, then you go on the offense and talk about anti-Semitism. This isn't anything new. Jim has been experiencing this forever. He knows it well. We have seen this, I think, as we have seen the rise in progressive engagement and activism at the grassroots, which is very much seen in the latest polling. The same kind of voices that are engaged and active in BLM and Dream Defenders, for example, we've seen anti-Semitism rallied to attack those forces themselves and push them back. We've seen anti-Semitism used to bring down the Women's March. We've seen it rally to say that BLM is anti-Semitic, and that a candidate who took money from Dream Defenders was anti-Semitic, because Dream Defenders is treated as anti-Semitic because of their criticism of Israel. It is such a powerful tool. And it's powerful in part because Democrats in general have not yet figured out how to defend the spectrum of views that exist within the party base on Israel. If you are a Republican, whether or not you give a crap about Israel, you recognize this issue as an unbelievably valuable tool. You can take the issue of Israel or BDS, because remember, we've now sold most of America the narrative that using nonviolent protest in the form of personal boycotts of Israel or settlements because you're objecting to Israeli policies. You have sold the narrative this is anti-Semitism ipso facto. So you just toss the hand grenade of BDS or criticism of Israel in among Democrats and watch them attack each other, right? At the worst case scenario, they just go outright and call each other anti-Semites. Best case scenario, they get to use a both sidesism. So somehow Marjorie Taylor Greene's overt hatred of Jews is balanced off by members of Congress who are critical of Israel's policies. And the Democratic Party has yet to figure out any way to contend with this. And until they do, they're going to keep, it's predictable where this goes. And I will say, it's also predictable, and I've written about this for years, progressives who allow this to happen, it's not just about Israel-Palestine, it's allowing Israel-Palestine to become a Trojan horse for progressives giving a kosher stamp for illiberalism. And here I'll point again at the so-called anti-BDS legislation in states, where you effectively have created a template for US states with the backing of Democrats and progressive Democrats, US states to legislate against free speech. And today you have multiple states that are seeking to pass similar legislation that would impose punitive action for those who, in 2 states, I think you have legislation for those who boycott the fossil fuel industry, using almost the same legislation as a template. You have legislation introduced this week at the federal level that would seek to bar the US government from doing business with banks that have decided not to do business with arms manufacturers, right? It's again the same template. And progressives are on board with this. And it's out of sync with the grassroots, it's out of sync with the base. And fundamentally, the reason they've let themselves get on board with this is because they don't want to be called anti-Semitic, because they've bought into a new definition of anti-Semitism. While we have actual lethal surging anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews because they are Jews in the United States and worldwide, they have bought into the framing that says that the real threat is anti-Semitism that is hidden behind criticism of Israel. And the current the debate around Gaza is a case in point where you see the argument that yes, there are moments of actual anti-Semitism we have seen in demonstrations in the US and around the world. But that's anti-Semitism because anti-Semite's gonna anti-Semite. That doesn't mean that defending Palestinian rights is anti-Semitic. And the desire to conflate the two, it's opportunistic and it's cynical, and it reflects a cruelty when it comes to the basic humanity of Palestinians. But instead of pushing back on this strongly, as I said, you see some members of Congress having letters attacking other Dems. And you see this almost knee-jerk sense of, okay, good, now we can criticize the Marjorie Taylor Greene's more strongly because we can also criticize our own. And in the process, the welfare and the humanity of Palestinians is sacrificed, and any informed, reasonable debate on Israeli policy is taken off the table.
I want to try to see if I can keep my service here long enough to make this point, because it ties into everything that's been said. But the millennials and the Gen Zers, I feel like, have shown the power of the grassroots, to your point, Lara, but to many points that have been brought up. And I also, Black Lives Matter was brought up, but I also want to name just the fight for Native sovereignty that has come up again. We get to call Deb Haaland Secretary Haaland again. That was not by accident. There are a lot of conversations, and for better or for worse, tying in, making the comparisons, helping people to understand, because in large part they have been indoctrinated. Everything that you said, that's exactly what it is. And tying all that back to the young people who, quite frankly, they do not care what you call them. You know what I mean? They really have justice at the core. And I think 2020, I believe, was the first cycle where we had more young young people of age to vote than we did baby boomers. And that's obviously only going to increase. And they are loyal to no one except people and planet. And to me, that is, it's not that our work is done, but it gives me courage to keep going and keep fighting, and understand that there is light somewhere there, maybe at the very end of the tunnel, but it's there. And it can kind of, like I said, just gives courage that I think we all need sometimes.
Mhm.
Anyone else want to respond to anything that's been said so far? Okay. So we have some specific questions in the Q&A that relate to actually a whole range of issues, but let me just pick one specifically having to do with this gap. You know, obviously there's a gap not just between the public and their elected officials, but there's a gap even between some elected officials, or even really where the new center is emerging or appears to be emerging within the Democratic Party. I think Lara mentioned Senator Menendez, and where the president himself is on this issue. I mean, from what I can tell, the president seems to be kind of the most hawkish on this issue within his party. And so, and someone mentioned in the Q&A, there was this recent letter of former campaign staff, I think 500 or so former Biden campaign staff, who sent a letter to Biden, to the president, urging him to support Palestinian rights. How new are those things, and how significant are they in terms of moving the needle? You know, it's one thing for the needle to move on public opinion and even at a political level, but if it's not shifting policy, then does it really matter? So I want, I'll throw that to Jim first, but all of you are welcome to take a piece of it.
Number one, just let me be thankful that we have a practitioner on the panel, Rania. I mean, I think those of us who see it in one way don't get to always see it the way she does, working with candidates and advising them in terms of what works, what doesn't work as they move forward. And she's worked for a host of progressive candidates who actually get it. And I think that that's where the change is coming. I mean, it's not, as Peter said, there's not a transmission belt where you start here and you end up there. Rather, it's a slow and incremental process that is actually moving in a different direction. What the staffers did, actually, I think that Hiba Muhammad, who used to work for me for a bit and is the one who organized this petition of former staffers and DNC staffers, that's rather unprecedented. And number one, that there were 500 people who felt that way in a campaign, and that 500, given the changes in technology, could get themselves organized and actualize their dissent and get a public splash for it. That's big, and indicates that what's changing is that people aren't just sort of feeling, well, I'm really upset about this and I'm gonna be upset about it. I'm upset about it and I have the tools to use to concretize my being upset and bring all those who feel the same way I do together and make a statement. And we're going to see more of that. as we go forward. And so I do think that there's a process here that is underway. The numbers say one thing, but the concrete statements from the Bernie, never forget, when Bernie in New York at that debate challenged Hillary on Israel Palestine, and he got whoops and yells from the audience. That was a turning point for him, because I knew him before. And when he saw that, oh my God, this actually works. This actually matters to people. There's a difference there. And I think, yeah, Joe Biden goes back. The first time I testified before him was in the mid-70s. He was on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He's been in this game a long time. But I think, the sense of where his campaign staffers were and the people who wanted to beat Donald Trump and who wanted to replace him with a Democrat, that was important. But I don't think he was always aware of where they were on issues, and now is going to be becoming aware. And he has moved toward the progressive side on so many domestic issues and even some foreign policy issues. This is the last holdout. And it's the one that is the most ingrained, but I do believe that a chipping away process is underway. And look, people say to me, you're just sounding like an optimist, the glass is half full. And I say, yeah, but I remember when we didn't have a glass. And I think that there's a beginning of a process here that I don't want to shortchange.
I just want to add to that, and I am jaded as can be, so I'm not glass half full. I do have a little bit of idealism left, and I have all kinds of opinions about Joe Biden, but that's probably a whole nother meeting for another day. But the one thing I will say about him and his administration is you can have conversations and you can push him, and that is what's happening. I feel like I fight. Well, we won't call it fight. I debate with them on a weekly basis, multiple times a week, across a whole host of issues, from climate to justice to Israel Palestine, and there is movement to be made there, and it is actually possible, because again, with all the things I could say about him, there is an openness to consider things in a different way. And this is again where I feel like public opinion goes hand in hand with the shifting of policy. I often joke, it's not a funny joke, but rarely does a politician wake up thinking that deciding that they're going to do the right thing. They have to be pushed. There are exceptions, of course. I'm going to get myself in trouble, but 99% of the time, I shouldn't assign a percentage. Rarely does it just happen on its own. More often than not, and we've seen this throughout history, public opinion has to push those elected officials to push policy in a different direction. So I don't think the two can be decoupled.
I could can I jump in? To me, the really interesting test case is going to be Kamala Harris, because Biden has a long track record on this. He's very ensconced in a very particular point of view for a long period of time. I think Kamala Harris is it's almost like a pure test case of where the politics are, because she has no long history of this. She has no deep commitments on this issue. She came to it very recently. Her standards were all classic. Her statements were all classic milquetoast AIPAC stuff, right? So she would be a real client if it was. We won't know, obviously, while she's still vice president, but she would be a clear test of something having changed. A couple other points. I think maybe this is obvious, but I think American public opinion on this issue kind of only remains latent until Palestinians on the ground actually activate it by forcing the issue. So again, if you a little bit think about like the Black Lives Matter, kind of a parallel, it was once Black Lives Matter created that movement, that gave us a chance to see that white liberal public opinion had moved. But we wouldn't necessarily have known that or seen that had not been this movement forced the issue to the top of people's agenda. And so I think a lot will simply depend on whether there is continued kind of Palestinian uprisings in a way that force people to reckon with this issue. Otherwise, it doesn't, people might have latent progressive views, but they'll never be expressed. And the last point I just want to throw out there, and I don't really know how this is going to play itself, but I just think it's a big looming issue that we will have a big impact, which is we're probably more and more heading to a foreign policy environment, which is of the Cold War variety, in which China is the dominant issue. And one thing I wonder about is whether, as we go back, we move into a world which, again, a little bit like the Cold War, countries will be judged more than on any other issue. Are they with us? Are they with China? That actually may make it harder to continue the move towards pressuring Israel, because Israel will be seen as a country on our side. And it will be a country that we want to keep on our side, and we want to fight. We want to fight them, whether it's on 5G or whether the Chinese controlling some port in Haifa or whatever. And that will become the issue that defines more and more the U.S.-Israel relationship. And it may be another excuse to basically say, well, we can't afford to have a fight with them on the Palestinians.
And I'll just add, I think it's too soon to definitively make any judgment on the Biden administration and its Israel-Palestine policy. I say that as someone who is incredibly frustrated and feels somewhat betrayed by this president's actions in the past few weeks. That said, looking at the sort of arc of history, President Biden is in an unenviable position in dealing with this issue, regardless of where the grassroots is, as a policy matter. He has walked into office with the cover of the Middle East peace process gone, right? Obama had a tough haul, but at least he was dealing with an Israel that at least pretended it was interested in peace and a two-state solution. So you could wrap yourself in the comfortable cloak of supporting two states and trying to get negotiations restarted. And you had on your horizon what the political horizon was, which was two states. That has been shredded. It wasn't serious in the Obama era, I would argue, from the Israeli side, but at least there was a pretense which allowed the president an easier time on policy. That is now shredded. 4 years of Trump, which is explicitly clear, the Israeli government is not in any way aiming at a two-state solution, at any kind of equitable solution, at any solution that comports with US longstanding policy, international law, international consensus. So you have a president who has to find a way to navigate a policy where that political horizon is gone, and you have an Israeli government which now that we have lost the comfortable place where we can say, don't worry about what we're doing, we're heading towards peace. It is no longer avoidable that the policies and acts of this Israeli government are inconsistent, incompatible with the post-World War II liberal world order that this president came into office promising to strengthen and restore. You know, the ICC is an example of this. Does the US actually stand with this liberal world order, rule of law, rules-based world? Because if it does, at some point, Israel has to stop getting impunity. But to stop allowing Israel impunity is a line politically that's very difficult for a president to cross in US politics, and I think actually where the guts of this president are. There's no comfortable place for this president to sit on Israel-Palestine, except one that requires an almost complete reframing of the issue, very much along the lines that were articulated in the report that came out of Carnegie not that long ago, which is where you say, okay, we're going to put aside two states or, peace process, whatever, and just work on rights. That's a very powerful, that shift would align very well with, I think, most of the findings of this latest poll that Jim is presenting. But that would be a profound psychological shift for most of the community that cares about this issue, right, left, center, and for an administration. And I think it'd be very difficult politically, which is why even today, the most progressive voices, except for a couple in the Democratic Party, are still, just almost slavishly devoted to reminding people that they support the two-state solution, two states, even when that is not even available on the table to discuss, and you have an Israeli government which is devoutly opposed.
I kind of want to pick up on that, a point that Lara made and also that Peter made about Palestinian leadership. In terms of a vacuum, there's a vacuum in Palestinian leadership. But there's also this kind of political and diplomatic vacuum left by, there's a big gaping hole where what we used to call the peace process used to be. And so how much of a liability is it to have that political vacuum in terms of solidifying people's views? People can say, oh, that's terrible what I'm seeing on TV, these images. But if they don't know what it is that they should be rallying around, is it Palestinian statehood? Is it equal rights? Is it stop the dispossession? What is the agenda? Clearly, when you don't have a coherent Palestinian political address that is articulating that vision clearly, there's a disconnect there. So I wonder if you guys can talk a little bit about that political vacuum that exists both as a result of the absence of a diplomatic process and this very lacking Palestinian leadership.
Yeah, if I could just, I was. Oh, sorry,
okay.
Go ahead, Jim.
No, it's okay. Go.
No, I mean, I was having a conversation with Fadi Karan, who some of you may know, who's in the West Bank, and I thought he made a very interesting point. Nelson Mandela didn't just become this internationally known figure, by accident. He had a party, the African National Congress, that made a concerted effort to build. I mean, many Black South Africans knew who he was. People around the world didn't know who necessarily he was, but there was a concerted effort to raise his profile, and then he became this very important symbol in the 1980s when the anti-apartheid movement around the world really started to gain steam. And of course, it gained steam in conjunction with the state of emergency on the ground in South Africa, where the ANC's local allies were essentially had created an intifada that never ended. And what you have in this case is two very different things. First of all, you have something that in the South African context would have been unimaginable, which is a Palestinian leadership that's essentially doing security cooperation with Israel, acting as Israel's subcontractor in order to keep the costs of control low. But you also don't have you have a very vibrant civil society activist movement, but you don't have a political movement organized around a potential political leader or leadership that allows you to imagine what a different politics would look like. And so I think that there are really critical missing pieces here that you saw in the South African case that were part of why people were not only able to say, I oppose apartheid, but I have a vision of what would replace it and the people who might be able to lead that change. And in some ways, what we have on the Israel-Palestine front is we kind of are getting towards the first part, people being able to say what exists is unacceptable, but much, much greater difficulty in imagining an alternative, precisely because, as I think, Khaled, you were implying, the assumed alternative, which was the two-state solution, is now is more and more distant as a vision of an alternative.
Through the 70s and up until the 80s, the PLO provided that kind of vision. The Israelis demonized them. They did their best to ostracize them as well as they could. Silenced them here in the United States. The U.S. made an agreement with the Kissinger agreement that was made with Rabin that we would not speak to the PLO, and we didn't. But they did project a vision, and they did some rather fascinating writing about the future and what the state should look like. And it was inspiring to many, many people around the world, including to Nelson Mandela and including to a whole range of third world leaders who saw Palestine as a symbol and saw their own struggle within it. Oslo changed that and created a situation that became rather tragic because of I think a profound miscalculation, which I think we have to admit to. They became a dependency on international donors. Look, I was running a project for Vice President Gore to build the economy of the West Bank and Gaza. We couldn't because Israel wouldn't allow imports and exports to operate freely without their control. Companies that lined up backed away because it simply didn't become profitable and they weren't the business of doing charity. And so what happened was you had an economy develop in the West Bank that became two things: dependent upon day labor in Israel and those settlements, and international donors and the remittances from Israel of their own taxes, which they would withhold at will when they decide that they don't like what the PA is doing, to subsidize a bloated public sector that was necessary because there were 40,000 families that depend on them for jobs that they couldn't get because you couldn't grow a private sector economy. And so that's the tragedy of the PA. It's become, as Peter said, a subsidiary. It's become a subcontractor, not just for the occupation, but it's become a dependency on all of these forces. So their interest is in not having a vision and not projecting change because they got 40,000 families to feed. So civil society in the West Bank gets squashed. Issa Amro, who was interviewed by CNN, was not only arrested by Israel and charged, he was arrested by the PA for criticizing them. They don't want dissent in the West Bank that's under their control. They want to keep it down because it protects the patronage system that they've put in operation. Now, Hamas, on the other hand, has become equally corrupt in a very different way, and a patronage system of their own that they rule by force, just like the PA does. And I get criticized for this among Palestinians, but look, there was developing a really brilliant civil society, popular struggle among youth in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah, which was drawing tremendous international attention, and around Al-Aqsa. And I fault Hamas for hijacking that to make themselves the center of the story. So it shifted from popular struggle youth leading this brilliant protest movement to rockets, which was a losing strategy, if anything. And declaring victory is just pathetic. You don't declare victory when 230 people are dead and your country is destroyed. You know, that's not a victory. I don't know what the hell it is, but it's not a victory. And nothing's changed in Jerusalem, incidentally. Oh, by the way. So yes, I think Palestinians need a vision and they need visionary leadership. And I think that this election may have provided that. I mean, Nasser al-Qidwa had a brilliant strategy and a vision laid out, and Marwan Barghouti presents that same kind of charismatic leadership, but Abbas couldn't tolerate it. And I don't think Hamas could tolerate it either. They wanted an election that would solidify exactly the situation, that would legitimize the situation that currently exists in the West Bank and in Gaza. And the canceling of the election, I think, is one of the real tragedies that's occurred. But I do think that when you look at the really low numbers for Abbas and Hania, they're well earned. They worked hard to get those low numbers, and yet there's tremendous support for the Palestinian people. Yeah, and they need leadership, and they need their current political leadership to stop squashing the popular resistance leadership that is emerging from the ground up.
Thanks for that, Jim. So we're just about out of time, but I want to give Lara and Rania a chance to offer some closing thoughts before we end.
I'll jump in really quick to follow up on Jim. You know, the struggle that Palestinians face now, whether it's over leadership or, you know, getting some sort of consensus over the political horizon and what they're aiming at, is something that I think those of us who are not Palestinian have to deal with great humility. It is trying to build legitimate leadership under occupation is no small feat, particularly when that occupation systematically discredits or fights any leadership that does emerge. Trying to define an outcome when the international community has already defined, and your leaders historically have already defined an outcome, which is a massive concession, but is basically off the table. And then if you disagree, you are called, you know, all sorts of names. I really, this is a huge struggle. And I think, you know, those of us who care about the Palestinians should be working to give them the space to struggle with this and figure it out. In the meantime, though, looking at the polling, and this is just picking up on where Jim left off, the grassroots support for Palestinians that I've seen over the years is about support for the Palestinians. It's not support for the peace process. It's not support because finally we've got someone like Hanan Ashrawi who is, you know, we love and she's on TV, or because Abbas is better than Arafat. It's about recognizing a sense of solidarity, for empathy with, common humanity with Palestinians. And my sense from the experience I've had with the younger generations and the activists across generations that are now being activated around BLM and the like, is that resonates deeply. When it is, you know, grassroots led, it is not top down, it is human beings standing up and standing together and putting their bodies and their futures and their reputations on the line for what is right and making common cause within their own communities and across the world with people who share those values, I think that resonates powerfully. And I would expect when you see the data next year, the data that measures that sort of empathy support will still be strong and maybe even stronger regardless of what happens on the Palestinian political scene. And that I actually find, speaking before what Rania said about a generation that cares about people and planet, I think a generation that cares about people and planet is going to keep caring about the Palestinians and maybe care about them and relate to them even more when it's not somehow moderated through the top-down leadership, which by definition, by necessity, that kind of leadership is already engaged in compromises, moral, political, social compromises that are going to be extremely unpalatable. That's what leaders have to do. So I'm not quite as despondent, I think, about how the political vacuum figures into this. Maybe one thing I'm not despondent about. Rania, to you to end as the most knowledgeable and Palestinian voice here.
In a minute or less, please.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna, like 30 seconds. I just agree with everything that Laura just said, and I will just repeat again that grassroots movement cannot be separated from the push of elected officials and candidates and those creating the policy in this country. Those two things work hand in hand. We've seen it. We see it now. We've seen it across history, across movements, and I just I just encourage all of us to not let off the gas pedal. I think that's the worst thing that we could do right now is miss this opportunity to continue to grow and educate and bolster that grassroots movement that we're seeing. It's beautiful.
Thank you. So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that. On behalf of the Middle East Institute, the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and the Arab American Institute, thank you all for joining us, and a special thanks to our incredible panelists, Jim Zogby for such a thought-provoking report, and Rania Batrice, Peter Beinart, Lara Friedman, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you all back at our next event. Bye.